this is the great tension with discussing Venezuela because absolutely, Venezuela has been horrifically demonized by right-wing pro-business press, which is all of the press in Europe and the United States, incredibly mercilessly attacked by the Trump administration. Yet at the same time, Hugo Chavez and Maduro are idiots, people who truly, truly failed miserably and truly mismanaged their country.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
I'm all right, Ray. I'm a little bit disturbed.
Yes, it's been quite a troublesome time in America at the moment.
Yeah, it's an unjust thing that we're all expected to be more disturbed about the murder of a right-wing pundit than we were about the murder of a Democratic politician in the Midwest in June. But that is sort of where we are. And, as kind of a pundit who considers it his job to try to persuade people about things, it's pretty horrifying to see a guy get murdered for
Could you
it.
see this being like a John Lennon moment? From what I understood, celebrities used to just be like normal people that would walk about, and then John Lennon's assassination kind of changed all that and made celebrities a lot more removed from normal people.
Well, that's a great question. I think that absolutely. So for those who might not be aware, this is going to come out probably about a week or 10 days after the fact. But Charlie Kirk, a famous, surprisingly young right-wing pundit, was murdered in Utah while he was doing a sort of public Q&A. He was one of those right-wing influencers who he had subsequently become a much bigger deal, but I think he got his start showing up on college campuses, trying to own teenagers, which was less objectionable in his case because he was actually a teenager when he started doing this. He founded Turning Point USA back in, I think, when he was an 18-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
He
Because
died at
I was
31.
unaware that he had founded that, which is like a massive juggernaut today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, he built that out of nothing. Of course, it's a lot easier to build things out of nothing when you go find old right-wing billionaires and convince them.
You're sort of going with the current.
Well, I mean, regardless, this guy was a really talented guy who built a massive organization. Sure. I mean, with a lot of money from people who got exactly what they wanted out of it. But that's besides the fact. He was a really impressive guy. And just to go back to your question, yeah, I mean, he was going and doing like a somewhat antagonistic, adversarial, in a good sense, question and answer with libs on campus, though I'd imagine libs are a little thinner on the ground in Utah, at a Utah State University than they are elsewhere. And it's actually quite horrific. I would highly recommend not watching the video, but he was actually answering a question about school mass shootings right before he was assassinated.
Well, the other sad thing is there appeared to be a mass shooting at a school on the same day.
Yeah, as they were both unfolding at the same time. Again, to your question, I think absolutely you're right. This could have sort of a John Lennon effect in that many people are going to be less willing to go speak publicly. Certainly, every Republican congressperson is looking for an excuse to avoid town halls, as they have now. We've seen a lot of imagery over the past couple months of them sort of dissolving into what the heck are you doing about the genocide in Gaza and what the heck is happening to our healthcare costs, which were both ballooned and coverage was dramatically lessened by the big, beautiful bill. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, if I were working in security for a right-wing or left-wing pundit or politician at this point, I would be a lot more paranoid. I would be a lot more afraid. And I do wonder, just last year, I went to a rally for Jamal Bowman, a congressman who was turfed out by IPAC, and also not being the most impressive congressperson in Congress, but certainly IPAC turfed him out. And I went and saw a rally with Bernie Sanders and AOC, and there were no plastic dividers. There was nothing. They weren't concerned. It was billed a week in advance. They weren't concerned about snipers or anything along those lines. And I wonder if that's going to be the case, for the next year, for the next couple number of
Because
years going
Charlie did
forward.
have security. They were around him, but yes, he didn't have those sort of like bulletproof plastic things in front of him or anything. And sadly, there might be retribution or whatever. So, yeah, it's not good at all.
It's incredibly grim. This was a guy who I don't believe had a particularly positive impact on U.S. culture, but he did not. He certainly didn't deserve to die for that. And I mean, it is worth pointing out, and perhaps it's actually a good thing. This won't be coming out 3 days after the fact. This will be coming out a week and a half after the fact. It is interesting that a lot of people in the United States, not us, but sort of like normies, had no idea who Charlie Kirk was.
Oh, really?
And the first, yeah, I mean, of
Because
course,
they go outside and aren't online all the time.
exactly. So their first impression is going to be, oh, this lovely young man who was taken from us too soon, and what a horrible thing for. At this point, at the time of recording, we have no idea who carried out this assassination.
Yeah, the gunman's still at large.
It's worth pointing out that the FBI leader, Kash Patel, has been covering himself in great shame as kind of an idiot, announcing they have the guy, oops, that wasn't the guy, and just sort of tweeting it out instead of actually, attempting to resolve this very politically important crime. But I do fear, I mean, Ezra Klein came out with an obituary today that was fawning and like really pleasant, and oh, he was doing politics the right way. Meanwhile, I did I respond to that? I think, or it was someone else who's responded to it. But Charlie Kirk spent the day before he was assassinated trying to get everybody to pay attention to the murder of a white girl by a mentally disturbed black man that happened to be caught on video footage on a train
Hmm.
station. Certainly a horrific crime, but his motivations in publicizing that were essentially in the furtherance to a main agenda throughout most of his career, which is getting people more worried about black people. And that is not really taking a horrific anecdotal crime that may have ramifications that are worth looking into, such as why do we not fund mental health services? Are there certain classes of folks who should be forced into some kind of mental services, and turning it into like a big racial issue, which is basically what Charlie Kirk's job kind of was. Let's
Hmm.
not over romanticize this guy. However, let us not lose track of the fact that this is a 31-year-old with two children under the age of 5, a young wife who's now going to have to pick up the pieces, and yeah, a great tragedy. But let's not go overboard in lionizing this guy. We're going to spend this episode talking about another tragic waste, which would be the U.S. Venezuela relationship.
Just on one thing, has things simmered with this? Because when we first pitched this maybe a week or so ago, it felt like something imminent could happen. But lately, every time I look for something, it was like, that's last week's news. Like, is this a good sign that like maybe he's being distracted by something else? Because there's more Epstein stuff, so it feels like he might do something else.
Well, the more Epstein stuff there is, Rory, the more likely it is for him to try to escalate things here. I mean, we're recording this September 11th. It should be coming out, September 20th or thereabouts. And the biggest event that is in our sense of what's most recent with Venezuela would be the September 2nd attack on a boat full of 11 people, about which, as of September 11th, we have no indication 9 days later that these guys were anything other than 11 people in a boat.
So what it looked like was like a speedboat
Yeah.
that had left Venezuelan water and was in
Hmm.
international waters, and then
Yeah.
like we have like aircraft footage of it, and then it just explodes.
And
It's just
Senator Rand Paul has revealed that that was U.S. drone explosions. There's no question as to what happened here. Donald Trump gleefully posted this on September 2nd, announcing that we had killed 11 cartel members. No proof of that has been forthcoming. The U.S. Congress, which is supposed to be briefed on all acts of war, which this very much is, has not gotten any such information. And you referred to this already becoming sort of old news. The chances are that with everything else that Donald Trump is screwing up, I did a live program on, what's going on with attacking Qatar and attacking South Korea and attacking India. It's entirely possible that by the time this episode comes up on the 20th, this all will have faded into memory entirely. It's also possible that we'll have invaded Venezuela. So it's a good time. I don't know that we've ever done like a Venezuela-focused episode before, have we? I don't know.
I thought we talked about Venezuela as wanting to invade their neighbor.
Oh, back sort of Venezuela, Guyana, when that was a huge deal. But that was, I mean, that's got to have been over a year ago.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it was doing a bit of a, I think just doing a bit of an overview of Venezuela-U.S. relations, specifically mentioning just how it's incredibly frustrating that Maduro this has happened multiple times. He's, on the cusp of failing, has lost all legitimacy. And then Donald Trump rides to his rescue. This happened with the first Trump term. This has happened, and it's happening now in the second Trump term. Maduro, the guy in charge of Venezuela, is an extraordinarily illegitimate, not legitimate guy.
And just a bad leader.
Yeah, he's just, well, it's interesting, Rory. There's a tendency to, I don't know if lionize Hugo Chavez is the right word, but to sort of give him a bit of a pass, because certainly if you look at the electoral history, and there's been Venezuelan elections in 2024, which we'll talk about, 2018. I think there was both a 2012 that reelected Chavez and a 2013 after Chavez had died that gave Maduro some legitimacy. And then there was a 2006, and then there was a 2000 or 2001. And Hugo Chavez seems to have won all of his elections free and clear, whereas Maduro seems to have won the first one when he was the sort of chosen successor of Chavez. But 2018 is a barely legitimate election that he probably would have lost anyway if Trump hadn't been going after him so hard. And 2024 now looks, I think most people agree, including people that were standing up for Maduro and Chavez in earlier elections. Most everybody agrees that the July 28th, 2024 election was a flagrantly stolen one. But people give Chavez more of a pass because he was winning all these votes and this, that, and the other thing. It's not clear to me that Maduro is the guy who screwed everything up. It's very clear to me that it was Chavez who screwed everything up.
Well, just to give an idea of the democracy, it seems like it was maybe as democratic as, say, Mexico is now. And now it's at a 2, so it's gotten very bad. It's sort of Saudi Arabia levels of democracy. So
I wouldn't go quite that far.
Okay.
I mean, sadly, it's a Turkey levels country that whose democracy I used to have more respect for, because in 2024 there was a serious opposition party, opposition figures. There was a vote. This wasn't like the classic Assad style, like, oh, look, Maduro has won 99% of the votes. And it's like, no, like almost certainly stolen. But the official story of the Maduro regime was like, oh, he won 54% of the vote, or those aren't the exact numbers, but it was, it was sort of like plausible. And there was a real opposition figure who, of course, after the election had to flee the country. But, he was, so it's not, Saudi Arabia is, I think, overemphasizing that. So what is you've been mentioning these democracy figures often, or you're using what, Freedom House, or what are you?
Oh, sorry, Our World in Data.
So what is their source for Our World in Data?
Economist, I think.
Oh, interesting. Okay. The Economist is sort of, you have to realize the bias of these, I think it's just worth, so the Freedom House stuff is sort of a classic reflected thing. And I'm not saying that these aren't useful. They are, in fact, very useful. But these, like, can't remember what, the famous example was, and I don't know exactly which series of lists we're talking about, but most of these lists will put Israel in the top tier of democracies, despite that, slave population.
Israel is getting a 7.8.
So, and that's high in this.
So it's around America, yeah.
Yeah. If the thing with most of these rankings, and Israel, has a slave population of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and yet they are at the top of the democracy rankings and all these rankings.
So you think Indonesia would be more democratic? Because according to this, it isn't. It's a 1 point below.
Well, below Israel. Yeah,
Yeah.
Indonesia is obviously more democratic. Venezuela is obviously more democratic than Israel. I mean, clearly, because they do not have a slave population of Palestinians that amounts to the same population. Like Israel has 10 million people who can vote, and then 7 million people who can't, that they control. That is not a democracy. That is like Sparta. That is like a slave state. But we don't need to get too far into that. But what's interesting, and especially with Economist data, is that The Economist is all the information is useful and interesting. I've read The Economist happily for decades, but their coverage of Latin America is
Woeful.
imagine the most like coked up right wing.
So they're fans of Chile and Colombia, and that's about it.
No, well, they're fans of Chile when there's a right wing dictator in charge of
Oh,
it.
wow.
They're the kinds of people who I think The Economist probably, I don't recall the exact details, but they love Pinochet, they love the Chicago Boys. They endorsed Bolsonaro. They're now regretting it a little bit,
Yeah.
but like The Economist came out and was like, yeah, Bolsonaro is the right thing for Brazil, which anybody who had read 3 paragraphs on Bolsonaro and what
This is
his
a man
political
who said
movement.
he went to a child brothel on a podcast during an election.
That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, it was a Venezuelan child brothel in Brazil, which also shows the levels of poverty in
Yeah.
Venezuela.
So it's unsurprising to me that an economist democracy thing would. So obviously, so it's basically like The Economist is sort of like the last stand of like 1980s U.S. and UK. It's really great that we're supporting the Contras. It's like they're basically like a pro Latin American death squad publication and haven't really actually moved on beyond that. So it's unsurprising to me that they would put Venezuelan democracy below Saudi Arabia or whatever. So I'm just saying, sorry, this is a long digression, but when looking at these democracy lists, it's important. They definitely have
Oh, yeah,
worthwhile
yeah. You
information.
have to understand their bias and the pinches of salt.
This is the great tension with discussing Venezuela, because absolutely Venezuela has been horrifically demonized by right-wing pro-business press, which is all of the press in Europe and the United States. They've been demonized by governments. They've been incredibly mercilessly attacked by the Trump administration. Yet at the same time, Hugo Chavez and Maduro are idiots. They are people who truly, truly failed miserably and truly mismanaged their country. And it's important from both sides, it is to understand that, yes, even though these guys are complete morons who ran their country off the tracks, there is also still ongoing aggression and bias. And then, for people on the left, even though there's been this massive aggression and bias against Venezuela, it's important to remember that these guys are also anti-democratic morons, and that's sort of the tension when covering Venezuela. That I hope we do a better job than most of tiptoeing that difficult line. But it is something to keep in mind. So I would like to just sort of, do a little bit. I didn't do the full deep dive on like Venezuelan history here, but it is just worth just like it's a historically significant period of time that Venezuela has been run by this sort of Chavista joke government. And I think it's really important to keep in mind how it's too often described as, Venezuela's problems being all about Venezuela and Venezuela internally. And I think that in interesting ways that reflect poorly on the United States, but also reflect poorly on Chavez and Maduro, it's been the relationship between the United States and Venezuela that has been really, really important. And I think that's what we'll attempt to bring to this discussion today.
So you were talking about how the sanctions have just been completely disastrous for Venezuela.
Calamitous. I got this wrong for a little bit. In my mistaken interpretation of Venezuela, when I wasn't paying too much attention, was that Trump really, really came down on Venezuela in 2019. And that's true. That's absolutely true. We were already seeing large-scale exodus from Venezuela in 2019. The largest component Every big refugee flow has a sort of leading component, and then that can suck in a whole bunch of people behind them. It was with the refugee flow into Europe, there were a ton of Syrians. That was the largest population, but there were also Iraqis, there were also Afghanis, there were Libyans, and then there were economic refugees from as far away as Bangladesh and Sudan and Eritrea that were moving along those pathways that had been forged through Turkey by Syrians, through Libya. In the case of the border crisis of the Biden administration that helped get Trump reelected, Venezuelans are kind of that lead population. The exodus was sort of already starting because of incredible mismanagement, I thought, by the Venezuelans before Trump made it much, much worse in 2019 by cutting off all U.S. participation in the Venezuelan oil industry. I was wrong.
Hmm.
That's actually not the beginning. Crucially, before the exodus started happening, before the truly crisis, actual starvation being experienced in Venezuela, that was actually after sanctions that Trump put on the country in 2017.
Okay.
So that's a really important detail that I got wrong initially, and I think, it is also largely left out of most descriptions of what has happened to Venezuela. It's all nasty socialism, and to be clear, Venezuela is an example of nasty, stupid socialism. Like, these guys were morons, and they really, really screwed the pooch, and they really were poorly managing the country. But people were not starving to death. People were not leaving the country in droves until Trump slapped the country with sanctions.
So is this why Maduro comes across much more incompetent? Because a lot of the real horrors that have happened in Venezuela happened under him when actually a lot had to do with Trump?
Yes, but there's an additional dimension to that, which is just what has happened with oil prices.
Yeah.
And crucially, we're going to jump back to the 1950s here, and it's actually something that's happened kind of twice. Oil prices, well, the most important thing to know, since we're on it, the distinction between Hugo Chavez, why Hugo Chavez is remembered more fondly, why Hugo Chavez actually won elections convincingly, and why Maduro just looks like an ineffectual clown, is because Hugo Chavez's time in power was almost entirely perfectly coincided with the China shock to world oil and gas prices. Won election, I believe, in 1998 and became president in January of 1999 and was fortunate enough to die after winning re-election in 2013. And that is almost exactly, if you look at an oil price graph, that is almost exactly the fruit. It's not quite a hockey stick, but it's
Yeah.
just mounting, prices going up and up and up and up and up. And he died in 2013, right before oil prices crashed in 2014, a crash from which they have never recovered.
And Venezuela has the worst quality of oil in the world, but it also has the largest reserves of oil in the world. So it needs to have a pretty high price of, I'm just looking up here, between 45 to 60 just to cover production.
Yeah, it's
So 90 is nice for them, but as you know, how long's a piece of string? We're not oil experts, it's hard to know. And also who's allowed to work in this country. But basically, high oil prices is almost like a necessary for them.
yes, and you can be successful. And, Chavez's 21st century socialism looked very successful in that period of China shock oil prices. The crucial thing, I think, to remember about, so in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw a massive, massive spike in oil prices that was very brief. That massive spike, that because of inflation, looked like this incredibly, I think it hit $120 or $130 a barrel, looked like it was historically like a big deal. But if you factor out inflation, the massive, massive Ukraine spike that made everybody really uncomfortable and launched our sort of an inflation bout that we're still kind of trying to figure out how to deal with, that was just normal prices during the entirety of Chavez's time in power. Not the entirety, but like his prices just went up steadily until they sort of sat at Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine spike prices, and that was just what Chavez dealt with normally. So of course Chavez actually won elections. Of course Chavez looks so much more savvy and intelligent than Maduro, when in fact Maduro actually managing to hang on to power through this period of as you said, having the most expensive oil on the planet and nobody actually wanting oil anymore is honestly a lot more impressive than Chavez, if we're being honest. So let's go back to the 1950s. And a crucial aspect of the Venezuela relationship with the United States is very similar. It's something that I think Venezuela shares with Iran, which was initially, these were our guys.
Oh, okay.
That's a crucial element of why everybody in the US political sphere, or at least the leadership class that has been running this, I mean, back in 1979, most of the people at the top of US politics were already adults who were, remember this very keenly. Up until 1979, Iran was run by the Shah, who was our guy. By the end of, his time, he would occasionally, he wasn't like the hugest fan of the US relationship with Israel, but broadly, he was our guy. Like there's
Hmm.
a lot of, I guess it wasn't F, is it
Kind of
F?
like Saudi Arabia is today.
Yeah, very similar. Very similar, with more pretensions of sovereignty, but they were pretensions. I mean, he was our guy. Iran was our ally against the Soviet Union. At that point, it bordered the Soviet Union. This was a relationship we considered to be very central to the United States, and it was something that we took very seriously. So there's a lot of reasons the hostage crisis comes to mind, why Iran was solidified so concretely as a bad guy for the United States and U.S. popular culture, but mostly it was the betrayal. And Chavez and Venezuela kind of do the same thing. Throughout the mid-20th century, the sort of Cold War era, Latin America was a basket case, in
Mm.
part due to, well, for a lot of reasons. It was a basket case.
And none of that, America has no fault in that.
America had nothing to do with any of that, Ray.
It was doing its best to keep its backyard tidy.
We were just good neighbors.
Hmm.
Of course, that is not the case. We were organizing coups left and right. It was all a big, quite nightmarish. Venezuela was the big exception.
Hmm.
Venezuela was our guys. Venezuela was a flourishing democracy. Like it wasn't, Venezuela was kind of like cover, it was like, no, 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 no. Look, we can have positive relations with democratic nations, and Venezuela were those folks. I think their last coup was in like 1948 or something like that. They did have a dictatorship, but from 1958, arguably until 2018, they had an unbroken series of elections that looked free and fair. That did not mean they were having a good time, you know,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
all the time.
It's still a relatively poor country in Latin America.
Well, what's interesting is that they, from 1958, and this is, we've talked, it seems like we're always talking about Saudi Arabia and what's going to happen next or what have you.
I recently just found out there's an Asian Winter Olympics. Not only that,
Hmm.
it's being held in Saudi Arabia in a mountain in the desert
Oh, dear me. When is this?
this year sometime, I think.
This
Uh,
year.
it might, even if it's next year, basically they're trying to like pump water up a mountain to make snow. Oh my goodness, it makes the line look plausible.
That's
Yeah.
that's extraordinary. But I think that what has happened in Venezuela is actually kind of a plausible model for what happens to Saudi Arabia after the Saudi royal family, and what happens after. Unquestionably, Venezuela remained a impoverished country during this sort of period between 1958 and Chavez of like pro-US, there are guys, but there was enough wealth, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, when everybody wanted their crappy oil in the era of the oil crises that screwed over absolutely everybody who didn't have oil. They were kind of go-go good times for Venezuela. And they were able to certainly not get to the level of wealth that, say, Saudi Arabia has, but were able to at least buy off folks. I was listening to a podcast this morning that talked about how there were, in sort of the 1960s, there were sort of communist style guerrillas or whatnot, but what Venezuela was able to do was all the way back then, I assume facilitated in large respect by oil wealth, was able to do what Colombia is sort of trying and failing to do today, which is incorporate those, like the guerrillas apparently became part of the political system in Venezuela, became like a normal political party.
That's kind of like what has gone wrong in South Sudan, or was it? Is it? Yeah, where basically it was like, right, you now incorporate into my army, and it all fell apart. So Venezuela was able to finish that transition without causing a civil war.
Well, I don't know that it was military. I honestly haven't. This was something that was thrown away in a podcast. I haven't done the relevant reading, but what it seemed like to me, Rory, was it was more the leadership became actual politicians and became sort of their equivalent of the Democrats, for lack of a better comparison. Of course, that's a terrible comparison. So it appeared in this through the 1960s and the 1970s that Venezuela was like a huge success story. And this is a key component to just how committed and angry the United States has been against Venezuela, is that there were a lot of wealthy Venezuelans that were, it wasn't just that the general public was able to be bought off. Like there were a lot of people who made a lot of money in the Venezuelan oil industry. There are a lot of people in the United States who did real business with very competent elites who ran a very complex oil industry. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., is the state oil company of Venezuela, had a tremendous amount of power, but was also very well run. There's a lot of complexity towards shipping out and processing this difficult to work with oil. They did a great job. I've personally met, folks who did business with those folks, and that the fact that all of those nice folks in Venezuela that they knew and they did business with have been dispossessed and in many cases chased out of the country adds anger in the U.S. political system.
Very similar to Iran in that sense, because except it was BP got kicked out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, PDVSA is actually the state oil company. And one of the great things that the Chavistas have done to anger folks outside has been nationalizing oil resources. But back when Venezuela was run by President Carlos Andrés Perez, who was a big U.S. ally and was this example of just how lovely and great relationships can be between Venezuela and the United States. Back in 1976, he also did an oil nationalization. And it was generally accepted and okay because it was our guy doing it. Our guy within our sort of poster boy for okay Latin American democracy who's going to work with us, who's going to be pro-USA. And I mean, there's nuance to this, of course. Like it was pro-USA, but also Venezuela was one of the main movers in setting up OPEC, which is a cartel that was about raising oil and gas prices, which the United States has always had a fairly nuanced relationship with because we've always been a large producer of oil and gas. Yeah, so this was the Venezuelans were our guys, and much like Maduro, this sort of happy from the U.S. perspective, era of relations with Venezuela crashed on the back of the oil market. So in the 1960s, so 1950s, 1960s, the oil price is sort of, steady, but steady and reliable. We're making money. 1970s, Venezuela starts making a ton of money because of the oil crises on either side of the decade of the 1970s. We've got, I think, 1973 related to the Yom Kippur War and U.S. support for Israel. And then we've got 1979.
Well, it really kicks into high gear in 1979. I'm looking at another old favorite we like, which is oil prices with inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So at the start of the oil crisis, this is around $60, $70 a barrel in today's money. But once we hit 1979, it shoots up to about 100 and kind of hovers around the 90s.
Yeah. So and then what happens in the 1980s?
It goes crazy. It slowly goes down, but it's still high for a lot of the 1980s until we get to 1986.
Well, 1986, and then what happened essentially to even slowly going down, Rory, is catastrophic for a
Okay.
country that has become reliant on prices going up.
Because it does seem to peak at like, yeah, exactly at 1980 at about $150 a barrel.
Yeah. And then it just goes down and down and down until the late 90s when Chavez comes to power.
But there's a real crash in like 1985 where it goes down to about 40.
And that's where we lose the Soviet Union, which was also an oil, had become the same thing. Interestingly, the same thing happened to the Soviet Union, which became confident enough to invade Afghanistan
Mm-hmm.
because oil prices were doing so well during the 1970s. And then everything stopped working. And there's an added dimension to this, which is the Latin American debt crises. And Venezuela was certainly a part of that. I had just always understood that the way that it's taught in the United States or talked about in our media. It's like those Latin Americans, they borrowed too much money and they all, they screwed up. They don't know what they're doing. And that is, I think, on some levels true, but what's sort of left out is that they borrowed all this money on really low interest rates, on the understanding that that was something that was going to continue, and that's sort of what interest rates would do. But then in the late 1970s, under Paul Volcker, as a way to deal with inflation in the United States, he dramatically accelerated interest rates. So the Latin American countries that had probably borrowed too much money
Mm-hmm.
at, say, I don't know, 5 or 6%, went to roll over their loans, which is not actually a incredibly irresponsible thing to do. I mean, that's what happens. You borrow money and then you borrow some more money to pay back that money. And that's certainly the way the United States has been running at a very high
Yes, but
pitch.
America is magic. It doesn't have to abide by the
Yes,
rules.
yes, yes, indeed.
But
Um,
Venezuela does.
yes. So Venezuela, could have reasonably expected to be able to borrow more money at the same amount of money, but then all of a sudden in the late 1970s, their 6% loans start getting replaced by 20% loans. And all of a sudden, you've got a continent and worldwide debt crisis. So the debt crisis, coupled with the fact that nobody wanted to buy their oil anymore, over the course of really about 15, 20 years, led to escalating crises in Venezuela. It's this testament to just how stable that old stable system was, that I believe they continued to largely have peaceful transfers of power, but things were getting really shaky. I read about the Carrasco riots, which are riots and unrest in Caracas that are, some sources say killed hundreds of people and other sources say killed thousands of people. Hugo Chavez himself came to national notoriety attempting to carry out a military coup in 1992. And he apparently managed that failing coup pretty well. It actually managed to raise his profile in a major way. Things were shaky enough that he attempted a coup, went to jail for it, was then pardoned, because that's just sort
Okay.
of how politics were going, and was pardoned to the extent that he was able to run for election and win in 1998 and became the president of Venezuela in 1999. And
Hmm.
be, hmm?
No, a pretty good year for oil prices.
It is. Is that a spiking year?
It's sort of, for some reason they're crashing at like 98, and then from 99 upwards it keeps just going up.
So that's basically that's the year with the oil prices, and it goes up until 2014, or at least goes
Yeah.
up. Well,
It,
2008. 2008's a big dump down.
2002 they dropped down a bit to about
Mm,
35, and then
yeah.
from there again it's just all the way up to nearly, in today's money, nearly $200 a barrel.
Is that 2008 or yeah,
Yep,
that's
just before 2008, before it all crashes.
and then it crashes in 2008, but then it comes
Then it
back
just
up
sort of
into
goes, it just sort of chills there at roughly about 130
130 until 2014, at which point it crashes,
until,
right?
yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Hugo Chavez, that's incredible. I didn't realize that 1999 was the year when the march starts. So Chavez manages to be who he is. He manages to be as disruptive as he is because he gets into power the exact year that the oil prices go crazy, and then he dies 1 year before the oil prices crash.
It, It's not his fault. He did everything perfect.
it's an incredible feat of historic timing. And that's
Hmm.
how Hugo Chavez got to be who Hugo Chavez was. It's very interesting. Before 2002 and a coup against him, that it seems pretty undeniable that the United States played some role in.
I'm shocked to hear this, Rob.
I know, I know. Whether that was just on the level of USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, or whether there was, active, coordinated CIA working with opposition folks, I don't know. Regardless, it is entirely fair for him to become paranoid and antagonistic to the United States after we tried to do a coup against him. But it is interesting that weird, he was like, oh, he was in power in 1999. And it's like, sometimes the mental math is like, well, that means he overlapped with Bill Clinton for 2 years,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. And he was doing visits to sort of talk about just like, these two guys have been in charge of Venezuela for like 27,
Hmm.
28 years now.
Yeah,
That's,
pretty
that's
much.
crazy.
Pretty much just, yeah, the 21st century is those two men.
And he was apparently, like, throwing the ball out at Mets games, sort of baseball. So baseball, you will often get, like, a ceremonial visitor or something to throw the first pitch, in a baseball game. And, Hugo Chavez, who's actually a huge fan and wanted to be an American baseball player at one point, was like throwing out pitches, and he was like meeting with Bill Clinton at the White House. And he didn't start out as antagonistic as he
Hmm.
was. Something that I just never really thought about. We're encouraged to never think about, and I try to struggle against this in other parts of my analysis, but I never really thought about this in the Venezuela relationship. Obviously, the 2002 coup was a big effing deal, but also, the first George W. Bush administration was a period of incredibly aggressive, I mean, probably up until today and Trump's second administration, it was the most like full spectrum aggressive the United States had ever been. We're talking about invading Afghanistan. We're talking about invading Iraq. We're talking about from the outset, the global war on terror was the United States is dispensing of legal niceties, and we're going to be everywhere. Like we had boots on the ground in the Philippines. I mean, it
Hmm.
was really this incredibly sweeping thing, and very few people were standing up against it in any respect. And Hugo Chavez, of course, with the personal motivation of the coup that he experienced in 2002, was someone who's like, no, this is unacceptable. This is ridiculous, and we're not going to stand for it. And it is interesting, and it seems so foreign now. I mean, the United States, a couple days back, as of when we're recording this, let Israel bomb Qatar, like
Yes, which is
oil
just
market,
outstanding.
in the oil and gas market of, say, 1999 to 2013, when Chavez was president, like allowing anybody to bomb Qatar would have instantly shot oil prices up $30 to $40 a barrel, because that's just how tight the markets were. It,
And I'm currently looking at oil prices not too long ago after this incident, and they're all down like 1%.
Yeah, there was a brief, because like Qatar is like the heart. I think it's more natural gas focused, but yeah, like this is a huge oil and gas producer, and there was a 2% spike the day of, and now prices are just back to normal, and that's crazy. We saw the most crazy example of this was the bombing of Saudi Arabia in 2019, where the Houthis or maybe just Iran blew up like 50% of Saudi Arabia's oil production. Very briefly, it was able to be repaired and brought back online very quickly. But like, if you had done something like that in between 1999 and 2013, it would have been like a stock market crashing, inflation crisis, nightmare everywhere. And that's the magic moment for oil producing countries, in which Hugo Chavez got to be president. So he got to be this very flagrant, what's the word that I'm looking for? Thorn in the side of US imperialism. That's what he got to be, with seemingly zero consequences. Whereas, of course, Maduro, after the crash in oil prices, it's been all consequence.
All consequences and, yeah, no oil money.
Exactly. So Chavez kind of got to do whatever he wanted. Yeah,
Like, he
and
had the greatest climb in oil prices in history. Because
yeah.
as I say, they were super low at like 22 in 1998,
Hmm.
and we say, they nearly hit 200.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary, one of the most lucky. Hugo Chavez is probably one of the most lucky politicians in modern history. Just and so he got to thumb the United States in the eye and like constantly. He wasn't wrong about the Bush administration. He wasn't wrong about the invasion of Iraq. He wasn't wrong about the war on terror. But it was an incredibly stupid thing to do from a country that is entirely reliant on not just high oil prices, but on selling oil to the United States.
Yes.
Like, most of the refineries in the world, my understanding is that most of the refineries of the world that can handle
Hmm.
Venezuelan oil are in southern Texas. Like
It's
that was
also the
the.
fact, I think this is
Mhm,
very similar oil to what Canada has. So it's just oil
mhm,
with loads of sand in it. So it's incredibly hard to work with. But yeah, America is an
mhm.
incredible processor of oil. Editing Rory here. I've got a few little things wrong. While Canada does have what's considered some of the lowest quality oil in the world, Venezuela's is only the second lowest quality in the world, considered extra heavy crude, which does need a bit more work. America is an expert in this, but Brazil does have some refineries.
Yes, and it's so it was always an incredibly risky and stupid move for Venezuela for Hugo Chavez to set himself up in this role, but oil markets were so tight, and the United States was very heavily engaged in blowing up Iraq at the time, which was another massive oil and gas provider. So he just gotta kept on getting away with
I'm
it.
out. I've done everything right. See you later.
It's like, peace. This is going to be great. It is very important so a key part of Chavez's time and power that he was very generous. He did a lot of great things with all the money for the Venezuelan people. I think that's laudable stuff. Unfortunately, he also paired that with extraordinary mismanagement beyond the crowning idiocy of antagonizing the country that buys all your oil. He also eviscerated the Venezuelan state oil and gas company. Basically, he used it as his piggy bank. He used money that should have gone to maintaining facilities, improving facilities. He used it for social programs. He used it for corruption. He used it for bribes. He actively chased out a lot of the highly specialized, highly competent engineering staff that worked for this company. I think even to this day, like, folks in the Mexican oil industry are pissed because all these really highly educated Venezuelans showed up and took a lot of jobs because Chavez just straight up chased them out. So in a period of adversity when not everybody is as desperate for oil as they were during sort of the China shock years from 1999 to 2013, all of a sudden, the Venezuelan state oil company, it became very apparent that it was being run by morons and political cronies. So it's not just that Chavez was antagonizing the wrong person to antagonize and creating a great rolling sense of betrayal and anger in the United States. He was also quite literally murdering the goose that laid the golden eggs, and he ate it basically, and then he handed all of this off to Maduro.
So you were saying that he wasn't as bad. Like, have you seen anything where you're like, he's actually done something good here, but just been dealt like with all the terrible hands?
No, Maduro's a thug. I mean, he could instantly improve the prospects of his country by leaving. Instantly improve. It is 100. Even if I believed that Bolivarian socialism or 21st century socialism or this, that, and the other thing was the 100% worthwhile and the way forward for everybody, the only sensible strategic thing to do at this point for Venezuela would be to let somebody else come in and run the country. Like, and I do not believe that Bolivarian socialism, 21st century socialism, is that and the other thing, is the right thing for Venezuela or anybody. It's Maduro is holding on to power solely to hold on to power. It's understandable. I think a great thing would be to offer Maduro political asylum in the United States. Like just allow him a Swiss bank account and a guarantee that he'd be fine, and let him build himself a compound in Las Vegas. And I think that he would instantly be like, "Are you sure I'm guaranteed?" Or probably we'd have to build that in China or Russia somewhere, and that would be ideal. And then Venezuela could go back to having at least a semblance
Hmm.
of transfer of power. And the terrifyingly frustrating thing is that almost happened. It almost happened. Chavez dies, and then there is another election in quick succession. Was it 2012? Chavez wins again, and then they do another election to give Maduro some legitimacy. And Chavez, he's this magical figure who is just made of oil money. And of course, Maduro's his successor. So I think you can say unreservedly that Maduro did win his first election. It's all crisis after that, after the oil price declines. And I think in any other world, if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, I think Maduro would have been a past tense kind of guy.
How do you think he's managed to stay in power? You were saying quite often sanctions mean the populace are so weak they can't overthrow these dictators. Is it something similar to that? Is that what you think kept him in charge?
I think that's part of it. I think it's Donald Trump.
You can just say this horrible American imperialist is trying to invade us.
Exactly. And because it's not wrong.
Yeah,
like, like that,
because they
that's,
have been moving a lot of naval ships around Venezuela, which is quite scary if you're Venezuelan.
yeah, exactly. It's terrifying. But and that was the case in I think it was 2019 when, but by 2017, Trump came in and he was going to be tough, 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 because that's being against Latin American socialism is how you win Florida. And he was tough, tough, tough. And I mean, Donald Trump, from the perspective of a left-leaning Latin American populace, is the boogeyman. He's terrifying.
He's like a parody of an American politician.
He's a parody of what Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were talking about. He's the demon, and he quickly filled his foreign policy. I mean, we never talked about this in the United States, but I assure you they were talking about it in Latin America. Like, he had people in his administration like Elliot Abrams, who is associated with genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s. Like John Bolton, who's like, we got to invade everybody all the time. There was an attempted coup. I think there's some American special forces. That was the first Trump administration, right? There was also Juan Guaido. Like, we announced that this guy's going to be the president now. We did everything.
Is he the guy that looked a bit like Obama?
Yes, we did everything we could to make Maduro look like a hero against American imperialism, and it kept him in power. And I mean, it's very straightforward, pretty obvious. The Biden administration shamefully, idiotically didn't back off many of after Russia invaded Ukraine. So I guess about halfway through. No, I guess just a year into Biden's administration, in the name of world oil markets and dealing with that short-term spike, the Biden administration backed off some of the, basically country-killing sanctions that Trump had slapped on, first in 2017 in a minor way and then 2019 in a big way. Biden pulled back a little bit and then brought many of them back. But even with that, like Biden, Venezuela was just not a priority for Joe Biden. He didn't, really think about it much. And in July of 2024, there was another election and Maduro straight up stole it. Venezuela has electronic voting systems, and for a long time, probably until they were able to adequately fake them, they refused to release the electronic records of what actually went on. And what was extraordinary about this is that with Biden, who just didn't really care that much about Latin America, there was no solidarity for Maduro, because in the first Trump administration, when he started going after Maduro, a lot of Latin American countries were like, "Oh, well, obviously Maduro sucks, but like we can't have this American imperialism." The Biden administration, there wasn't any American imperialism, and despite the fact that there was this second red wave, this incredible troika of, in the most powerful Latin American countries, Brazil, Mexico, and I think it's fair to put Colombia as number three. All three of those folks, of those countries in 2024, were headed by stridently left-wing governments, and all of them, after the July 2024 election, called out Maduro for stealing it and called on him to release the actual information. And if Kamala Harris was president at this point, I think that that momentum would have continued.
I've also found some other damning information. Maduro apparently paid Boris Johnson £240,000 for a meeting.
Oh, Jesus. That sounds very characteristic for both Maduro and Boris Johnson. It makes me feel worse about both men, which was hard to do. But yeah, so that's the thing, is like, if you just lay off, if you just like, the United States has had long-standing antipathy against the government of Bolivia, much less fairly, because the Bolivian socialist experiment initially was actually tremendously successful for the Bolivian people. But in 2019, again, a Trump administration thing, we supported a coup against that socialist administration that lasted for a year, was a spectacular failure, and brought the socialists roaring back into power. Biden did essentially nothing about that. And the socialists fell out with each other. And now, through the ballot box, it's just straightforward democracy, Bolivia is now run by another center, right or left, pro-American, pro-business government, which is like great. That's like how things should work.
Democracy should go. People should be allowed to change their mind.
Exactly. And like, that's probably what would have happened in Venezuela if there weren't two iterations of the genocide-happy, murder-from-the-skies Trump administration. And that's absolutely what's happening here. So that's another great tragedy for Venezuela. And I guess, another stroke of good luck from Hugo Chavez laughing down from heaven or whatever, is that, this election could have ended up evolving into July 28th. It was a huge crisis across the summer and early fall of 2024 in Venezuela. There was real possibility of like Lula in Brazil, Petro in Colombia, and was it already Sheinbaum or still AMLO? I can't recall when Sheinbaum came to power in Mexico. But like this troika of left-wing leaders of Latin American countries pressuring Maduro to leave, and then in November Donald Trump gets reelected, and everyone's like, oh crap. Over the past month, Donald Trump has been, again, taking actions that are guaranteed to secure Maduro as a legitimate fighter against comic book capitalist, evil American imperialism, which is what Donald Trump is providing. He has been scrambling destroyers. He did this during the first Trump administration, putting a whole bunch of U.S. naval assets down there. But it was a lot scarier back then because it was before the Yemen Red Sea thing, which has been very humiliating to the U.S. Navy. Like, if I absolutely believe that Yemen's Houthi government is a much more impressive military factor than Maduro's government is, for sure. But still, I mean, Venezuela is not Panama. I made a video saying exactly that back in the first Trump administration. In 1989, it was very straightforward for the first Bush administration to essentially conquer Panama, throw out a dictator we didn't like. Panama is a tiny country with a tiny footprint and a tiny population, in which at that point, its capital city was made up of like half of it was like a U.S. military base. So it's a very, very different question. And especially after the experience in the Red Sea, it's, I believe, laughable that this idea that the United States is going to be able to invade and somehow overthrow the government of Venezuela. I very readily believe, especially considering this atrocity we committed on September 2nd, I would believe that we could try to assassinate Maduro,
Oh, yeah,
which
yeah.
would be an insane thing to do, a norm-demolishing thing to do.
But would that also cause, like, most of South America just to despise America?
Absolutely, of course. It would be a complete destruction of our reputation down there, but
Mhm.
it's not clear to me that Donald Trump cares about that one
Oh,
bit.
no, no, no.
Yeah. One of the great virtues, one of the only virtues of the amount of time that the United States has spent brutalizing the Middle East over the past 25 years is it has allowed Latin America to sort of make its own choices and go its own ways. And we've seen in multiple countries, they have elected leftists who have done some good things and done some bad things. And then they have gone out of power, and it's really only Venezuela that I mean, Nicaragua to an extent, that has but Venezuela and Cuba that are the subject of nonstop U.S. aggression are the only places where these left-wing dictatorships are able to persist. If we just took the aggression out of the equation for a solid 5 years,
Mhm.
Maduro would be long gone. I'm pretty sure that what's left of the Cuban dictatorship would dissolve in 6 months if they got fully unfettered U.S. trade.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it is purely these are enemies that are purely maintained for the convenience of having enemies in Latin America, which is the way that sadly way too much of our U.S. foreign policy establishment is oriented.
Is there a name for this? But it feels like America is so powerful that it can have problems and then manage to make money out of the problems in like a horrible misery circle. The fact is, like, constantly, it feels like America could spend money to help itself with like a drug problem. But instead of doing that, it's like, oh, this means we can invade Venezuela for reasons. Like, it's almost like there's just a constant misery circle of money going when, like, Venezuela, from what I understand, isn't producing these drugs, and quite often it's just, transit. So drugs are made elsewhere, they go through Venezuela, Venezuela then passes on to Caribbean islands, which then pass it on. So the idea that this speedboat was going straight to America, I can't see that happening.
Well, and the speedboat there's been no further information or
No.
intelligence provided about it because they didn't have it. They just
Yeah.
murdered some people.
And yeah, the boat was blown up at sea and then just left there. So,
Yeah, yeah. It's quite grim. But yeah, I think the best term to define what you were describing is the self-licking ice cream cone. Is sort of that's sort of how I mean that is defense spending and foreign policy thinking in the United
hmm.
States. So it's kind of grim, but it is kind of fascinating. Just like Hugo Chavez, just the luckiest politician of the past century. Just extraordinary oil market timing, that guy.
Okay, well, on that note, hopefully America hasn't invaded Venezuela by the time this goes out.
Yes, very much so. I agree.
And hopefully, I don't know, things get better there because it is quite grim and horrific.
It's quite sad.
So we'll catch you next time.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.